The weight of silence. Las Vegas in the summer of 1968 had a particular kind of heat. Not just the kind that clung to the skin, but the kind that pressed inward, heavy with secrets. Neon lights glowed even before sunset, buzzing against the dusk like restless insects. Inside the casinos, the air was cool, perfumed with cigarette smoke and expensive cologne, and thick with the hum of money-changing hands. That Saturday night at the Desert Inn was supposed to be routine. Another full house, another polished performance, another evening where laughter and music blurred together until midnight arrived unnoticed. For Dean Martin, routine was comfort, predictability was safety. The stage was the one place where the world made sense, where timing mattered, where control existed, and where applause followed effort in a way real life never guaranteed. But some nights carried a different gravity. Dean felt it before he could explain it. In his dressing room, he sat quietly in front of the mirror, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate care. The room smelled faintly of whiskey and cologne, the same scent that had followed him through decades of hotels, studios, and late-night performances. His face in the mirror looked calm, almost relaxed, but the stillness was practiced. Learned. He had learned stillness a long time ago. On the small table beside him sat a folded photograph, creased at the corners, edges softened from years of handling. It showed two boys standing outside a modest storefront in Steubenville, Ohio. One was grinning widely, full of uncontained energy. The other stood straighter, older, protective, a hand resting lightly on his younger brother's shoulder. Dean didn't look at the photo often. But tonight, without fully knowing why, he had taken it out. Bill. His older brother had been gone 3 years now. Long enough that people assumed the ache had dulled. Long enough that the world expected normalcy to return. But grief didn't follow calendars. It didn't shrink politely. It settled in quietly and stayed. Dean folded the photograph and slipped it back into his jacket pocket just as a knock sounded at the door. 5 minutes, Dean, the stage manager called. Dean nodded even though no one could see him. He rose slowly, took a measured breath, and reached for his drink, but before his fingers touched the glass, another knock came. Firmer this time. When the door opened, the man standing there did not belong to the Desert Inn staff. His suit was expensive in a way that didn't ask for attention. His expression was polite without warmth. "Mr. Martin," the man said, "my employer would like a word before the show." Dean studied him for half a second longer than necessary. "I'm preparing," Dean replied evenly, "after the performance." The man smiled slightly, but his eyes didn't change. He's seated near the front. He'd appreciate it now. Dean understood what that meant. Las Vegas ran on layers, money on the surface, power beneath it, and men who never needed to raise their voices because the city already listened. Dean had spent years navigating those layers without becoming tangled in them. He performed in their buildings, took their checks, shook hands when required, but he kept his distance. Until distance was no longer offered. "All right," Dean said. 5 minutes. The hallway beyond the dressing rooms felt narrower than usual. Carpet-muffled footsteps. Voices echoed faintly from the showroom where the crowd was already settling in, unaware that anything was amiss. Near the entrance stood a man whose presence bent the space around him. He wasn't tall. He wasn't particularly handsome. But authority radiated from him with the certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. A cigar burned slowly between his fingers. Several men lingered nearby, watchful and silent. "Dean Martin," the man said warmly. "Good to finally meet you up close." Dean extended his hand. "Good evening." The handshake lingered a moment too long. "I've heard a lot about you," the man continued. "I figured it was time I saw the show for myself. I hope you enjoy it." "Oh, I'm sure I will." The man smiled, then tilted his head slightly. We come from similar roots, you and I. Italian families, hard work, sacrifice. You don't forget that no matter how far you go. Dean said nothing. My people tell me you grew up back east, the man went on casually. Small town, steel mills, barbershop father, if I'm not mistaken. Dean's expression remained polite, neutral. That's right. And you had an older brother, the man said, almost as an afterthought. Bill, wasn't it? Something tightened in Dean's chest. Yes, the man nodded slowly. I heard about his passing. Shame. Still young. 56, Dean replied quietly. Heart trouble, they say. The man exhaled cigar smoke. Well, stress'll do that to you. Dean felt the shift immediately, the subtle change in tone, the way the man's eyes sharpened with curiosity rather than sympathy. Especially, the man continued, when you're living next to someone else's success. That kind of pressure eats at people. The words landed softly, but their weight was unmistakable. Dean didn't respond. I mean, the man added, glancing around as though sharing an observation rather than an insult. Imagine watching your kid brother become a star while you stay behind. Ordinary life, ordinary job. Must have been hard. One of the men nearby chuckled under his breath. Dean turned fully toward the speaker. You didn't know my brother, Dean said. The man shrugged. Maybe not. But I know how resentment works. No, Dean said calmly. You know how cruelty works. The air changed. The men nearby straightened slightly. The cigar paused midway to the man's lips. That's a strong word, he said. It's the correct one. The man's smile thinned. Careful. Dean met his eyes without raising his voice. You spoke about a man you never met. You reduced his life to a theory that suited your amusement. That's not insight. That's disrespect. The hallway went quiet enough to hear the distant music from the showroom. You think you can lecture me? The man asked softly. I think you should stop. For a moment, no one spoke. The man stepped closer. You know who I am. Yes, Dean replied. And you know who I am. The man studied him now, not as entertainment, not as celebrity, but as something unexpected. You're making a mistake, he said. Dean's voice did not change. You already did. I'm giving you the opportunity to correct it. Silence stretched between them. Finally, the man laughed, but there was no humor in it. All right, he said. Let's hear it. You're going to apologize, Dean said. Not to me, to my brother's memory. And if I don't? Dean didn't hesitate. Then I'll walk onto that stage and tell everyone exactly what you said. And who said it? The smile vanished. You wouldn't. I will, Dean replied. And you know I will. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the man's face. Seconds passed. I'm sorry, the man said stiffly. For what I said. Dean held his gaze. Say his name. The man's jaw tightened. Bill. Dean nodded once. Thank you. Without another word, Dean turned and walked back toward his dressing room. Behind him, the hallway slowly filled with sound again. Inside the room, Dean closed the door and leaned against it, breathing evenly. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the effort of restraint. Moments later, the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dean Martin. Dean straightened his jacket, smoothed his cuffs, and stepped toward the stage. The spotlight hit him like always, and the audience saw only the smile. The price of composure. The applause that night came easily. It always did. When Dean Martin stepped into the spotlight, the room forgot everything else. The band swung into rhythm, glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell on cue. To the audience, Dean looked effortless. Loose shoulders, relaxed grin, voice smooth as aged bourbon. But composure, when earned honestly, and is never effortless. Inside him, something was burning low and steady. He did not look toward the front row. Not once. He knew exactly where the man sat. He could feel that presence like a pressure point, unseen, unacknowledged, but impossible to ignore. Power had a way of announcing itself even when silent. Dean sang. He joked. He charmed. 90 minutes passed as if nothing unusual had occurred. That was the most dangerous part. Because men who were used to fear did not forget moments when fear failed them. Backstage, the moment the curtain closed, Dean's smile disappeared. He loosened his tie slowly, deliberately, as if sudden movements might crack something he was holding together through will alone. His manager waited inside the dressing room, pacing. "Dean," he said the second the door shut. "Oh, we've got a situation." Dean poured a drink but didn't raise it. "We always do." The manager swallowed. "Word spreading. He's telling people you embarrassed him, that you forced him to apologize." Dean finally took a sip. "I didn't force anything." "That doesn't matter to men like him." Dean set the glass down. "He crossed a line." "Yes," the manager said carefully. "But he's the kind of man who burns cities down over lines." Dean turned toward him. "Then maybe someone should have told him no sooner." The manager stared, realizing, too late, that there would be no retreat tonight, no smoothing over, no quiet apology offered in exchange for peace. "You don't understand how this works," the manager said. "You're a performer. You don't win these kinds of fights." Dean's voice was calm. "I didn't fight. I defended." The distinction mattered to Dean. It always had. He sent the manager away and sat alone for a long time. Long enough for the anger to fade into something colder, more deliberate. Bill would have approved of that. Bill had never been flashy, never loud. He had taught Dean that real strength didn't rush. It waited. It held. It chose its moment. The next morning, Las Vegas buzzed. Not openly, not in print, but in whispers. Dealers murmured. Bartenders exchanged looks. Men who knew better spoke softly. The story stayed out of the papers, but it traveled faster than headlines ever could. Dean received the first call just after noon. The voice on the other end was familiar, older, tired in a way only power could make a man. "Dean," the voice said, "what the hell were you thinking?" "Frank." Dean leaned back in his chair. Good afternoon to you, too." "You stood up to him," Frank said. "Do you have any idea what kind of storm you've invited?" "He spoke about my brother." There was a pause. "What did he say?" Dean told him. All of it, without embellishment. When he finished, the line stayed silent long enough that Dean wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Frank exhaled. "I would have lost control. I almost did. But you didn't," Frank said. "And that's what scares me." "Why?" "Because you made him look small without touching him. Men like that don't forget humiliation, especially when it's quiet." Dean closed his eyes briefly. "I didn't do it to humiliate him." "I know," Frank replied, "but that won't matter to him." "Then let him be angry," Dean said. "I won't apologize for defending my family." Frank sighed. "Hey, let me make some calls." "No," Dean said. "Don't. You don't want allies?" "I don't want this buried," Dean replied. "I want it understood." Another pause. "You're different," Frank said quietly. "You always were." 2 days passed, then came the visitor. He arrived unannounced, mid-afternoon, dressed like a businessman who didn't need introductions. Polite, controlled, dangerous in a way that didn't announce itself. "My name is Anthony," he said. "I'm here because certain people are concerned." Dean didn't invite him inside. He stood in the doorway, one hand resting casually against the frame. "Concerned about what?" "About escalation." Dean smiled faintly. "Funny, I feel the same way." The man nodded, acknowledging the line had been drawn. Or you embarrassed someone who isn't accustomed to it. He embarrassed himself. That may be true, the man said, but truth and consequence don't always travel together. Dean's gaze hardened. Are you here to threaten me? I'm here to explain reality. Dean waited. Apologies, when extracted publicly, the man continued, carry a cost. Others begin to wonder. They test limits. Dean nodded once. Good. The man blinked. That's not the usual response. I'm not a usual man. The visitor studied him more carefully now. If you tell this story publicly, it forces a response, one that won't be pleasant. Dean's voice was steady. I won't tell it. But if he ever mentions my brother again, publicly or privately, there will be no second conversation. The man considered this. Thought that's your condition? Yes. And in exchange? I let it end here. The visitor extended his hand. Dean shook it once. Brief, firm, final. That night, Dean sat with his daughter at the kitchen table. She watched him quietly, the way children sometimes do when they sense cracks adults try to hide. You're thinking about Uncle Bill, she said. Dean looked up, surprised. How did you know? You always get quiet first, she replied. He smiled sadly. He taught me most of what matters. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You did the right thing. Dean felt something loosen in his chest. Over the following weeks, the city settled. The man left town. The whispers softened. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. But something had shifted. People looked at Dean differently now, not with fear, with respect. And he hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened violence. He had simply refused to surrender his principles. And in a city built on noise, restraint echoed louder than force. Late one night, Dean took the old photograph out again. He studied Bill's face, the calm confidence, the quiet pride. I didn't let it go, Dean said softly to the empty room. I hope that's okay. The silence felt warm rather than lonely. Outside, Las Vegas pulsed on, lights, laughter, deals made and broken. Inside, a brother's memory remained intact, and somewhere deep in the machinery of power, a lesson had been learned. Not everyone could be bought. Not everyone could be frightened. And some men, when pushed, did not break. They stood. Time did not heal what happened in July. It only buried it deeper. For weeks after the confrontation, Las Vegas behaved as if nothing had changed. The casinos stayed loud. The dealers kept smiling. The same men occupied the same corners, laughing too hard at jokes that weren't funny. On the surface, the city returned to its practiced illusion of normalcy. But beneath it, something was off balance. People noticed it first in small ways. A table that usually filled stayed empty longer than expected. A backroom meeting got postponed without explanation. A man who once demanded attention now waited to be acknowledged. These were not accidents. In Vegas, accidents didn't repeat. And at the center of that quiet disturbance stood Dean Martin, a man who had never sought power, yet somehow unsettled it. Dean felt it too. Not fear, not anticipation, something colder. The awareness that once you forced a man to confront himself, that he would either change or sharpen his knives. Autumn arrived early that year. The desert nights cooled, and with them came the season when reckoning felt inevitable. Dean was midway through another run of shows when the second message came. This one did not arrive by phone or messenger. It came through absence. A table in the front row, always reserved, always filled, sat conspicuously empty. Night after night. No cigar smoke. No heavy laughter. No silent entourage radiating threat. Dean noticed. Everyone noticed. The absence spoke louder than presence ever could. Backstage, whispers began again. But they were different now. No longer warning tones. Curious ones. What happened between him and Dean Martin? How did a singer make a man like that back down? Did you hear he apologized? Apologized. The word itself felt dangerous. Dean avoided the conversations. He had learned long ago that survival didn't come from explanation. It came from consistency. So he did what he always did. He showed up, performed, and left. But power does not like unanswered questions. 3 months later, the city tested him again. The Stardust restaurant was quiet that evening. Dim lighting, hushed voices, the kind of place where deals were implied rather than spoken. Dean sat at a corner table with friends, laughing easily, a glass untouched in front of him. Halfway through the meal, a waiter approached. "Mr. Martin," he said carefully, "there's someone who would like a word." Dean did not ask who. He already knew. The private booth was darker than the rest of the room. The man inside looked older than Dean remembered. Not weaker, older. I am the kind of age that came from reflection rather than time. "Dean," the man said, rising slightly, "thank you for coming." Dean remained standing. "Say what you need to say." For a moment, the man hesitated. That alone told Dean more than any words could. "I've been thinking," the man finally said. "That's new," Dean replied calmly. A corner of the man's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You embarrassed me." "I corrected you." The man nodded slowly. "That's the difference, isn't it?" Silence stretched between them, thick with everything unsaid. "You didn't have to do what you did," the man continued. "Most people wouldn't." "Most people don't get to choose when their family is disrespected," Dean said. "I did." The man looked down at the table. "I lost a brother too. Long time ago." Dean said nothing. "Well, when he died," the man went on, "people said things, stupid things, and I punished them for it." He looked up now. "You didn't punish me. You made me look at myself. That's worse." Dean finally sat. "You could have destroyed me," the man admitted. "You had the room. You had the audience. You chose restraint." Dean met his eyes. "Restraint isn't weakness, it's control." The man nodded once. "That's what I learned." They sat there in silence, not enemies, not allies, just two men acknowledging a shift neither could undo. "I won't mention your family again," the man said. "Ever." Dean's response was immediate. "Good." "And," the man added quietly, "if anyone else does, they'll answer to me." That was not an offer of friendship. It was a declaration of boundaries. Dean stood. "Then we understand each other." As he turned to leave, when the man spoke one last time, "Your brother must have been a good man." Dean paused, but did not turn around. "He was," he said. "That's why I didn't let it slide." Outside, the air felt lighter. Weeks passed, then months. The story faded into legend, retold in hushed tones, reshaped by rumor, exaggerated by distance. Some said Dean was fearless, others said reckless. A few understood the truth. He wasn't fearless. He was loyal. Years later, when the man died quietly, Dean received a letter. No return address. No signature beyond a familiar hand. It read simply, "You taught me that power without restraint is just fear wearing a suit. Your brother would have been proud." I was. Dean folded the letter and placed it beside the photograph he kept hidden away. That night, he stood alone on his balcony, Las Vegas glowing beneath him like a restless animal. Power still moved through the city. Violence still whispered in corners. Men still mistook cruelty for strength. But somewhere in that machinery, a line had been redrawn. And it had started not with fists, not with threats, but with a man who refused to let love be mocked. That was the night power blinked, not because it was challenged loudly, but because it was challenged calmly and lost. What remains after power is gone? Power never announces when it begins to fade. It simply grows quieter. Years passed after that night in Las Vegas. The city changed its skin the way it always did. Old casinos torn down, new ones rising brighter and louder, each promising permanence while quietly planning replacement. Faces came and went. Names that once carried weight were spoken less often, and then not at all. But some stories refused to disappear. They survived because they were never about dominance. They were about restraint. For Dean Martin, life moved forward the only way he knew how, steadily, privately, without spectacle. He kept performing, kept showing up on stages where the lights erased the past for 90 minutes at a time. To the public, he remained unchanged, charming, relaxed, unbothered. But those who paid close attention noticed something deeper settle into him. A stillness that wasn't emptiness. A calm that came from having already chosen what mattered most. Dean spoke less about success as he grew older, less about fame. When asked in interviews what he was proudest of, he deflected with humor or changed the subject entirely. He had learned that the most important truths rarely survived explanation. A family did. He kept Bill close in quiet ways. A photograph in his study. A name spoken carefully around grandchildren who never met the man but knew his presence. Dean made sure they understood that greatness didn't come from applause. It came from how you treated people who could never repay you, especially the dead. In the mid-1970s, after a show at the MGM Grand, someone told Dean that a familiar face had been in the audience. A man older now, slower, gray where there had once been black. Dean asked for him. Backstage, the years peeled away the tension. No entourages, no posturing, just two men who had survived long enough to understand cost. "You still sound the same," the man said. "You don't," Dean replied gently. They spoke about unimportant things at first, the weather, how Vegas no longer slept the way it used to, and how the city felt less dangerous and more hollow. Then the man hesitated. Something rare enough to matter. "What you did back then," he said quietly, "changed me." Dean didn't answer right away. "I spent my life thinking fear was respect," the man continued. "I thought if people stayed quiet around me, I was winning." He looked down at his hands. "But when you stood there, calm, unmoved, I realized something. They weren't quiet because they respected me. They were quiet because they were afraid." Dean finally spoke. "Fear doesn't last." "No," the man agreed, "but dignity does." They shook hands. No tension, no debt, just acknowledgement. When the man died years later, Dean did not attend the funeral. He sent no flowers. But a letter arrived weeks afterward, written before the end. It was short. "I spent my life surrounded by noise and ended it understanding silence. You taught me the difference. Your brother mattered. So did you." Dean folded the letter and placed it with the others he rarely revisited. That night, he sat alone longer than usual, not mourning the man, remembering Bill. Bill, who never saw a stage. Bill, who never needed applause. Bill, who taught his little brother how to stand his ground without raising his fists. Dean understood something then that had taken decades to fully settle. Legacy wasn't what people said about you when you were gone. It was what they carried forward because of how you lived. Years later, when Dean himself passed, his family found the quiet evidence. Not awards, not headlines, but photographs, letters, small reminders of people he had protected when protection was inconvenient. And among them, the photo of two brothers outside a barber shop in Steubenville. Dean's daughter would later say, "My father never measured strength by volume. When someone disrespected Uncle Bill, my father didn't explode. He became immovable." That was the truth. The night a powerful man mocked a dead brother, the world expected noise, anger, violence, retaliation. Instead, it witnessed something rarer. A man who refused to surrender love for safety. A man who understood that defending the memory of the dead was an act of living courage. A man who showed that real power does not threaten. It sets boundaries and stands behind them. That was why the response shocked everyone. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was dangerous, but because it was unyielding. Dean Martin did not shout, he did not strike, he did not beg. And he simply stood for someone who could no longer stand for himself. And in doing so, he revealed the truth that outlives all empires, all fear, all reputations. Power fades, fear collapses. But love, quiet, loyal, uncompromising love, remains. That is what survived that night in 1968. That is why the story is still told. Not because a mob boss was humbled, but because a brother was honored.